You are listening to Talking Africa, the show that gets behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. My name is Nicholas Norbrook. From all of us here at the magazine, we hope that you are safely locked down and that you and your loved ones are well in these testing times. My guest this week believes in the possibility of change. Thomas Piketty is a professor at the Paris School of Economics, the author of the surprising blockbuster Capital in the 21st Century. You can find him on Twitter at Piketty Le Monde. That's at PIKETTYLEMONDE. His new book, Capitalism and Ideology, has now been translated into English, and it takes aim at the idea that the rules of economics are fixed, and that actually the way economies are organised are far more down to political choices. That matters because since the 1980s, African countries have been given a single ideological vision of what works to make countries grow, despite different visions starting to become visible in Asia, for example. He says that it is at moments of great stress, which is precisely what this coronavirus will deliver over the next year or so, that ideologies reveal themselves to be fragile. So we will jump into the book, Capital and Ideology, in a second, but our listeners would tell me off if I didn't ask you a question about this present pandemic gripping the world at the moment. But I'll ask a coronavirus question in terms of ideology. One of the striking things in the West is how quick they are to junk the ruling ideology and orthodoxy when it comes to a crisis. It's all small government, open markets until a crisis hits, and then suddenly everything changes. The European Central Bank has jumped in with $750 billion of bond buying. The US Fed has pumped trillions into the financial system, but also created something called the primary market corporate credit facility and has started extending money to the real economy. And this is the central bank of the US actually funneling money to US companies with very little oversight or intermediation, which recalls the Soviet Union or perhaps South Korea or Japan or China during different phases of their history. And I feel this chimes with one of the central themes of your book, that the political choices behind the economy are governing ideologies are, as you put it, truly autonomous. And while from the 1980s onwards, economists want to portray the rules of economics as something similar to the third law of thermodynamics, immutable, and therefore the rules to manage the economy are also immutable, when actually those in power choose to make the economy as it is. And the proof is that, when they want, they can suddenly make it 180 degrees differently to how it is, as we've seen at various points in history. Does that ring true?
Yes, definitely. I mean, what we see today is a confirmation of the fact that economic ideologies are very fragile, and our economic system also is very fragile. And times of crises like the crisis we have today are always times when dominant ideologies are being challenged and possibly go through a major transformation. So this is something we see throughout history, and this certainly illustrates one of the general theme of my book, which is that our economic conceptions are much less permanent and sort of deterministic than what some people sometimes like to pretend. And things have changed enormously in the past in terms of dominant views about the role of government and the way to organize the economy, and this is going to change again. Now, I would like, especially in the South and especially in Africa, also in India, I would like this crisis to be met with, in a way, sort of ambitious social programs, and in particular quick development of basic safety net program in countries where it does not exist at all. And I think the strategy of pure lockdown and sort of putting people back in their home when they have a home is not going to be sufficient. Well, I think it's not going to be sufficient in the north either. But of course, in poorer countries where you don't have a proper safety net, if you can't go and work, that cannot last for very long. And so there's a big risk that in fact this strategy in a few weeks will be unsustainable. And so. I'm very, very concerned about this. If we look, so now today, everybody now is comparing to the Spanish flu episode 1918-1919. What we know from this episode is that mortality rates were much higher in poor countries, in India, in Indonesia, than they were in the West at the time. And obviously there's a risk that we have the same outcome today. So, I think there's really an urgency to put in place a basic safety net program, and sometimes these things happen very quickly. Major social or fiscal reform happen very quickly because of emergency, and I think this crisis, especially if I think looking at what was happening in India these past few days, I think it's not going to work. The way the government and the Modi government in this instance decided to send back home all the migrants and rural workers who were working in the cities without a proper home, and just sending them back home in the countryside in practice can be just a way to spread the virus, and also this is not providing any form of income support, and this makes the whole idea of a lockdown completely unsustainable very fast. So anyways, there are really very big issues about how to deal with this crisis, and of course at this stage it's premature to know how this will in which direction this will go.
Obama's chief of staff early on, Rahm Emanuel, spoke of not letting a good crisis go to waste. Is it possible to argue, now even more strongly than after 2008, that if rich countries are able to use these unorthodox economic practices during a crisis, then emerging countries absolutely should do the same? And in this case, do you suggest there's an opportunity for African countries who do wish to, slip these ideological shackles they've been wearing since the structural adjustment period? Could there be a silver lining here, an opportunity to seize?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want to instrumentalize this crisis because it can get so bad in terms of mortality. I think, here the real issue is what do you do for, when you don't have any safety net, any unemployment insurance program, any income transfer program, and you ask people to stop working and to stay at home, what do you do a couple of weeks later? And this clearly calls for, immediate and very strong action in terms of income support and in terms of basic safety net. And there are some countries which I think administratively are almost ready for that. Of course, it requires a state capacity, state administration that is not always in place. But it's you see that all the time in history, where in times of crisis we sort of accelerate this kind of development of administrative capacity in order to address basic problems. So, yeah, I think this could be and this should be an opportunity for this. Which, of course, the immediate problem is this income support for people who will be locked down, or some of them will be sick, but most people will be locked down. Then the next problem will be how to pay for that, and so that's not the immediate problem. The problem at this stage is to deliver the income and to deliver the food in some cases. But then, of course, the next question will be how you pay for that. So this raises questions about what you do with your public debt, what you do with your monetary policy and money creation, what you do with your tax system, what you do with the way you organize economic relation between countries. So this raises a whole set of issues which I study in my book in an historical perspective. And, of course, it's much harder to predict the future than to look at history, but certainly one of the big lessons from my book and from history is that this dominant views about how to organize the economic system, can change very quickly in response to crises like this one.
Across your two books, Capital in the 21st Century, and then your latest one, Capital and Ideology, you sketch out a Western world where the First World War partially, and really the Second World War, put a stop to the world that came before, which was dominated by political regimes who are perhaps more responsive to the demands of business, let's say. And at the end of the Second World War, another crisis / opportunity opened a window of progressive legislation, progressive taxation, collective bargaining, inflation, investments in public health services and other public infrastructure, which helped create this 30-year window where social democracy, to have it a shorthand, flourished. So what were the driving actors that made this period of greater equality? Is it too simple just to resume it to the actions of various states?
I guess the only thing that I will qualify a little bit or maybe change a little bit is that I think it's more than just a 30-year window. I think the way I view what happened over the past century is more that there is a long-term process toward a reduction of inequality and toward a better regulation of economic forces. And this process was certainly accelerated in this 30-year window after World War II. But if it worked so well, it's because it was under preparation for a much longer time. So already, in the late 19th century, there was the beginning of a development of a system of labor law, and there was a beginning of a system of an intellectual movement toward the development of a policy platform, a policy program in terms of putting up a social security system, a progressive taxation, free education, which then the actual implementation of this program was certainly accelerated by World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, which contributed to transform quite radically the dominant view about the market system and the needs to have a more social embeddedness of the market and economic system. But it's really a mixture of short-run crises, response to crises, and long-run intellectual movement, which in the end produce this historical change. So I really stress this dimension in the book because, I think it's important to realize that this long-term process through which inequality was reduced started much before World War I or World War II. It started with the socialist movement in the 19th century. In some way, it started also in the 18th century. I show in my book that you have, at the time of the French Revolution in particular, you have discussion about progressive taxation and reduction of inequality, which does not materialize as much as one might have expected it to materialize, but first things could have happened differently. I stress in my book the multiplicity of trajectories, the fact that these are not deterministic processes. Time of crisis are times where multiple paths can be taken depending on the balance of power between groups and also the balance of intellectual power and political battles. And in the end, even if it did not materialize, this contributed to prepare the way for what would happen earlier. So I think what's important is to change the narrative as compared to, there was sort of a narrative that was developed in the 1980s, 1990s, very much based on unlimited faith in free market and market competition. This was a narrative